Welcome to the Hard Skills Show, where we discuss how to develop the most challenging soft skills required to navigate today's leadership complexities and tomorrow's unknowns. I'm your host, Dr. Mira Brancu, and my new Millennials Workbook for Navigating Workplace Politics book just came out on December 3rd. Get your copy today, and in honor of that, seasons 6 to 9 are all dedicated to this topic. Season 6, which is where we are right now, is all about positive politics. And today we have Zachary Ames giving us some insight on influencing and other communication skills that he teaches other people, other leaders, and especially some that might be seemingly at odds with each other. So we'll explore why and how. Let me just introduce him to you for a second here. Zachary Ames is an award-winning leadership and talent development expert with over 15 years of experience in startups, Fortune 500, and global private companies. He has lived in Singapore and New York, but he also started out in Salt Lake City, which helps him bring kind of a global approach alongside a local sensibility. Zach owns a coaching and consulting firm, XYZ Leadership, and is the host of the Expand Your Zone podcast, which is what XYZ stands for, by the way, and recently launched Prism Leadership, aiming to accelerate and advance the careers of LGBTQ individuals. He is a member of Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches and the creator of Forefront, the premier global accelerator for the next generation of coaches and talent development professionals, which is how we met. I was in that first cohort of Forefront. So very excited to have met him in this way and now have the opportunity to showcase his work. And in his spare time, he enjoys skiing in the mountains and hiking with his 100-pound chocolate Labrador Cooper. So welcome to the show, Zach.
Thank you for having me. An absolute pleasure.
Yes. And did you just hear his voice? He has the perfect voice for a podcast. I'm so jealous. So listen to his podcast when you have a chance.
Hopefully a decent face too, as the old adage goes. It used to be a
Absolutely.
voice for
Yes,
radio, and now podcasts, we've got
that's right.
video.
That's right. That's right. Now, let's start with some easy softball ones. I am not a skier. It sounds cumbersome to me. I'm not a great fan of the cold. I'm not a fan of heights or anything where gravity pulls you quickly from one height to the next at the bottom. I'll put, roller coasters in there, but I do enjoy hiking. And I'm curious for you, what is hiking with a 100-pound Labrador? I would imagine it's the exact opposite, being quickly pulled up against gravity.
Luckily, he's a true lab, very curious. He's not necessarily always on a mission. He's highly distracted, so I'm not necessarily being pulled up the mountain by him. I'm often trying to get him away from the trees and to stay on the trail. So it's a good, fun time.
Yeah, and out of curiosity, any leadership lessons you've learned from your Labrador and hiking with him?
I think, I mean, even as we're going to get into some of this, right? Some of the basics of just the behaviors and how do we influence, how do we get the right treats and rewards and those kinds of things. But what I've really actually learned, and a lot of the trainers I've been following, is the idea of even dog psychology. It's actually all about the relationship. As much as it is, we think it's about obedience, that only gets you so far. It's actually that if you can get your dog to really want to be with you and sees you as the pack leader, it makes life a whole lot easier.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes. All right. So you mentioned influence. Let's get into that influence piece,
Yeah.
right? You do a lot of work around that. You do also do a lot of work around giving and receiving feedback. It's probably one of the most popular, needed skill sets, right? That people ask us about. And you also do things around positive workplace politics. That's something we have in common of interest. And as I was looking through all of the work that you do and the ways that you take people there, right? I was starting to think that some of these might be at odds with each other, right? So, for example, if you influence people, what you're trying to do is get people to see things your way and to agree with you around your way, right? And at least that's our understanding of influence. And if you're in a position to give feedback, there's this sort of message that you are the one in the position that must give feedback to somebody else, and that other person has the issue that you need them to fix. But the opposite is that if you influence, you might not be as influenced by others. Or if you give feedback, you might not be as receptive to receiving feedback from others, right? And so I'm wondering how you think about these sort of like dualities when leaders lean into learning these skills.
So I think probably what we might tap into in a few different ways is actually, I think a lot of it sits with mindset. So even the way that you've kind of set the premise, we often have a lot of points of view of how we would think about it, right? When someone says, oh, I have to have a feedback conversation, there a whole set of emotions kind of get set off. I often tell people, right, when I'm coaching with someone, people will call and be like, Zach, I have a difficult conversation coming up. And I go, well, you just labeled it as difficult, right? And so I've reframed that for most of my clients is I have a meaningful conversation coming up. And now that's why I have to give that to you. That's why it might feel difficult is because there's something really important that needs to be shared. And we may not have the skills to do it, but that doesn't mean the conversation itself is difficult, right? And I think even to your point of maybe if I'm influencing, I'm not influenced, or if I'm giving feedback, I don't get to have it. There's a weird little irony in there is actually one of the greatest influence techniques is to allow yourself to be influenced. The ability, and most of you probably know this, right? If you've got a partner or anyone, or even sometimes kids at home, the ability for you to show your partner that I am listening, that I may actually adopt an idea you have. I agree with one of your points, right? We here in the US just came off of political season. We're going into holidays. Everyone's talking about, oh my gosh, what's going to happen at the dinner tables? And I actually think one of those things is instead of fighting and thinking it's a debate, actually come in with curiosity and be like, oh, that's a really interesting point. How did you come to that? And show your willingness to listen. Now, I'm not saying you have to change your mind. I'm not saying you have to do all these other things, right? But your willingness to be influenced or being open to it will most likely increase the chances that they will sit and listen because now you're not an enemy. They're not in protection mode. They're willing to also listen to your point of view, or more likely, even again, the way we replicate body language or we replicate questions, they're more likely to ask you a question out of curiosity and listen to your idea because you did the same for them.
Yeah, I think that's really important that you turn it more into a relationship, right?
Yeah.
Like a give and receive. And I'm wondering, I think people who are first starting out with leaning into that might fall into the trap of making it a performative thing,
Hmm.
right? Like I'm going to act like I'm willing to listen. I'm going to use all the right words. I'm going to say, interesting, tell me more, like all of the sort of words that they learn, right? How do you help transform that mindset from the sort of tactical, performative, here's what I must say in order for someone to feel like they're being listened to, into actually listening and caring about what the other person has to say?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to be honest, sometimes those going through the motions isn't always a bad thing because, again, it's the skill. If we are trying to build the muscle, if we are not good at asking those questions or leaning forward or nodding our head, that's not necessarily a bad place to start. So I wouldn't completely say don't do those things because it is a skill set. And I think that's the beauty of even, this show is that's the whole point is we're learning how to do these things. These are not innate. It's not that I magically am better at this than anybody else. So we might actually need to try that out. Now, I would probably say, how do you do that in a safer environment at the beginning or when there's, the stakes aren't as high, so you're more comfortable, right? It's why we go to it's why I'm actually at the gym right now, is so that I can ski, right? I'm practicing before I perform. And those are those big moments. But I think exactly as you said and what we've already alluded to is you have to go in with that mindset. And I think that's actually why it's sometimes scary. I think it's why people, because there's an unknown at the end of that conversation. If you come in thinking, here's how I want it to come or end, this is the result I want, you will be rigid. You will be in protection mode versus going, I have a point of view and a perspective, and it may be the reason and an important factor. And yes, I would prefer us to get to this direction. But if we're that tight on the actual result, we're not going to be in a relationship and it will start to shift out of influence and it will be command and control. And quite frankly, in my view, that's then not leadership, right?
Mm.
Um, so I think that's the piece you have to get really honest with yourself is I trust myself to handle the unknown. I can manage the conversation when it comes and they ask me something else. I'm open to listening when they give me a different point of view. As we all know, every story has two sides. So that's a big piece whenever I talk about feedback is you go in with your perspective, you have to be open to listening to theirs, right? And we can get into possibly a little bit later anything frameworks on how do we do that effectively, or more importantly, that doesn't mean we lose the line of sight of our point, right? Especially as a leader to an employee, quite often we do have a point to make. There is a serious consequence at the end. It doesn't mean we lose that and go on a wild goose chase when an employee or, again, a partner gives you, well, here's 20 other reasons why that didn't work. That doesn't mean I have to now go manage 20 different sidebar conversations. But that's often why we get nervous is because we recognize there's going to be information that we didn't prep for.
Yeah. I I feel like this is actually aligned with negotiation techniques as well.
1,000%.
Yeah, yeah. So let me pull together what it takes to have like this mindset that you mentioned. So number one, start with lower stakes. And when you start with lower stakes, number two, practice to perform.
Mm.
And number three, letting go of a specific result and being prepared to handle the unknown. And number four, be open to other options, another, other outcomes that are sort of combined between what you thought you were going into and what could come out of it as kind of an enhanced outcome. Is that right?
Yeah, even as you said, right? Whether that's in a negotiation or just deciding where we're going to dinner tonight with someone to actually needing to tell an employee that that project didn't hit the result well, or we missed the deadline and here's the consequence. All those things are very similar in that way. But to our earlier point, I think it's really the relationship and the premise. If I come in knowing that my goal and desire is for this to be a win-win for both of us, I want this to enhance our relationship, then we're not worrying about the back and forth and the battle and me versus you. We can actually sit on the same side of the proverbial table and find a solution based on the problem, not necessarily a battle between two individuals.
Absolutely. And one thing that we're reaching an ad break, so we're going to take a break for a second here before we go into our next section. But sort of to close out, one of the things that it's also reminding me of is this phrase that I learned early on when I was training within mental health interventions. And I don't love the phrase, but I totally appreciate what it means, which is like when sometimes you're working with people with depression or with anxiety, the goal is fake it till you make it. Fake it till you make it. And that's kind of, part of what you're saying here is like try out what feels very awkward and in a low stake environment to practice in order to get to the point where it actually feels natural for you to be back in that environment or to be successful in that situation. That's what I'm hearing here is fake it till you make it.
Yeah, and I don't remember where I heard this, but you can't credit me for it. But someone actually put a nice little flip on that said, face it till you make it.
Oh, I like that.
And I like
Yes.
that because that's actually what you're doing, right? So if I'm
Yeah,
actually practicing, I'm actually doing the behavior. It's not that I'm faking the behavior, I'm actually doing it,
that's
right? And so
true.
I'm facing the concern or the fear. I'm not hiding and really faking it. I'm actually trying. And so that to me is a much more accurate way to think about that from, and what I imagine is right out of that kind of CBT behavioral therapy world is, yeah, I may not feel like going to the party because of my anxiety, But by going doesn't mean I'm faking it. I don't have to tell people I love being here. But by
Mm.
walking out my door and experiencing my emotions and processing them, that's facing it.
Love it. I'm going to use that from now on. Thank you, Zach. All right, we're nearing an ad break. If you're listening to the Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Brancu, and our guest today, Zachary Ames. We air on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. on at Eastern Time, and at that time, you can find us live streaming on LinkedIn, YouTube, several other locations, and talkradio.nyc. And we'll be right back with our guest in just a moment.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant, and on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays, 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a high-achieving, growth-oriented leader? Are you interested in developing your authentic leadership while creating a healthy, inclusive workplace? Hi, I'm Dr. Mira Brancu, host of The Hard Skills on talkradio.nyc at 5 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays, where we discuss how leaders develop the hard skills needed to make a greater impact. We interview experts, have live coaching, and tackle these challenges. Listen to The Hard Skills on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern on talkradio.nyc.
If you don't have your health, what do you really have? It's time to feel good in your body and shift from struggle to ease. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Tripp, your host of Nourish the Soul, where we explore the sacred wisdom of your body while you sit back, relax, and go on a journey of self-discovery. Join me every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to awaken your heart, transform your well-being, and unlock a deeper understanding of yourself.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Welcome back to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Brancu, and our guest today, Zachary Ames. Now, Zach, we just talked about the mindset necessary to transition into starting to get better and better at influencing skills, communication skills, critical conversations, important, meaningful conversations is what you used, instead of quote unquote labeling them as difficult conversations, right? Once you sort of start thinking about embodying that mindset, you mentioned you have some frameworks around that. And I'm really especially interested in, I read about your methods using Aristotle's framework, using storytelling, using common like current marketing techniques. I would love to hear more about how you apply those to these skills.
Yeah, happy to dig into any of those or all of them, I suppose. So maybe we start actually, this isn't a new idea. Over 2000 years, since Aristotle wrote, I think it was the Treatise of Rhetoric or something, that really brought into light the idea of pathos, logos, and ethos. Many of us know those words. We may not exactly know what they mean, or we think, oh, that's some old ancient thing, but the reality is we use them all the time. And even in this space, as we're thinking about it, maybe as a direct conversation one-to-one, the reality is whenever I think about influence, we're in a constant dance of influence at most moments of our lives, right? I'm influencing someone else. I'm being influenced all the time. Every conversation I'm having, anytime I'm at the store, whatever it might be, these things are happening to us. So recognizing then, okay, what are the different methods maybe others are using, but also what might I be able to bring to the table? So very briefly, in terms of those definitions, I'll give you one example to bring it to life is when we think about the ethos, that I always kind of link back to the idea of ethics or credibility, right? Do I trust this person? Is really the first kind of question. Is there credibility to what's happening in this situation, right? I think we've all had that moment where someone says something to us and we're really easily able to give it no thought or concern because I don't care that that was the person who said it. But if, my mom said it, man, I might really care, right?
Mhm.
So that's, I think, a really interesting piece of it. Then we get into which is different from that, but is sometimes a bit similar, is logos, which is very simply our logic. Does it make sense? Is there data behind this? Does A and B equal C, right? And for many of us, that is another element that we go down and go, okay, does that actually just, quite frankly, make sense? And then we have the pathos, which is actually the emotions. And sometimes we like to think we don't make emotional decisions, but there's oftentimes it's a huge and key factor, and we can link that to storytelling in a minute. But emotions is actually a huge, and I will even be the first to admit and raise my hand that I don't really think I use my emotions that much. I had a colleague who used to get out what was called a feelings wheel and would, jokingly, but kind of not jokingly, have me point at them and label them. And I didn't think that when I had them, let alone made decisions by that. And the more I've studied this, I go, oh, I think I make most or many of my decisions from an emotional sense, right? So those were the three pieces, kind of this triangle that Aristotle was putting together. And my favorite way to bring them maybe all together in one spot, because some of us definitely give more weight to the others just based on personalities or our backgrounds. But we typically still use all three in some way. So I always go back to the classic courtroom. I love a legal thriller. And at the end of each of those TV shows or the movie, typically, right, there's a judge and two lawyers, and they have their closing argument. And what that lawyer typically is doing is using the fact that you are in a very nice building. The judge is in a robe. That lawyer is, very well dressed, and there's wood paneling everywhere. There's a huge amount of credibility given to this moment, right? This isn't happening in someone's garage or a backyard, and people aren't wearing their shorts and flip-flops. We have established really the ethos of this thing. And in our culture, right, we have allowed lawyers to be in a high status. Then, when they go through their closing arguments, they will walk you back through all the data points. If this person was here at this point, they couldn't have been here at this point, and therefore that's their alibi, they're free. Or if you look at Exhibit A, therefore this in relation to Exhibit B, here's the conclusion. They give you very logical walk you through the evidence. But that's not where they end. They typically end at the emotional state. And my favorite version of this is it could have been any of us that day, right?
Mhm.
They really try to get the jury to be in the shoes of the victim or of the person being, right, who they're trying to get off and who's wrongly accused. And the idea that, yeah, we are all human, we all have these emotions, we all relate to this thing. And now I'm coming in with a much more different, yes, the evidence might be there, but now I'm an emotionally invested individual related to it. So that to me is always a fun way to start to play things out, even if it's a really simple business meeting of like, okay, do I have enough data here? Did it, or am I only talking about my opinion? But if I only talk about data and I don't bring in some emotional understanding or relate to my audience, that's probably going to fall flat too.
Yeah, I can, even see now um what's played out in like at a broad stage in our society. Like you can make all the arguments in the world and people will still not agree with you
Yeah.
if you don't have the trust factor and the emotional factor. And you're right, like there are some people who will not trust you as much if you don't bring them the data, right?
Yeah.
um, and people who will not be on board with you enough if they really value the human connection and sort of like that storytelling piece, right? And I talk a lot about this when it comes to feedback, giving and receiving as well,
Mm.
which is that you're much more likely to accept feedback more easily from somebody that you trust, has your best interests in mind, than somebody that you don't know very well and doesn't know you. Because it's easier to say, well, you don't know me,
Yeah.
right? And so it makes so much sense that you need to sort of like use these three in a way that speaks to the person or your audience. And as we're thinking through that, I can see how storytelling and current marketing techniques use some of these. So I'd love to hear how you might apply that to, a feedback giving and receiving situation, or even a presentation that a leader needs to give in order for everyone in the organization to sort of be on board with a new change or something like that.
Yeah, so I'll flip to, if we think about the marketing side of things, again, a different take on it, we can see probably some parallels of the other triangle that I often play with in the marketing world is the idea of hope and fear, right? Very emotionally based, but the idea of, oh, I aspire to be like so and so one day, right? Every commercial of, you know, pick the piece of food and that it will make you happy. Or if you buy this product, right? And we're going to see a lot of that, especially with the holidays, of this idea of you do this and therefore that. It's the same thing also sometimes with the fear that I don't want this thing, or I'm trying to get away from certain elements, or more importantly, the third piece of that beyond the hope and fear, which most of those are speaking to, is identity. And that, I think, is my favorite place to really study and think about in a lot of different ways. One of my favorite pieces, especially when we think about this whole world, is in behavioral economics, because the basis of economics is that we are all making very rational decisions. I have all the information I need. I look at my choices and I do what's best for me. Well, behavioral economics basically has become a whole new, really bubbling up world of study, because we know we make irrational decisions. We do not make the decision that is always the best thing, or we spend money in really interesting ways. And when we look at that from an identity perspective, it's interesting. One of my favorite little studies on this was at the Petrified National Forest, I think it was. Basically, they don't want you taking, right? If anyone's been to a national park, you're not supposed to take the rock or the trinket or the fossil you find. And so on average, they were studying about 3% of the rocks. They put out fake ones. About 3% in 10 hours were taken. Then they put up a sign that said, other people, basically, rather than saying don't take it, they, from an identity perspective, actually said other people are taking these and therefore the request not to, basically don't be like these people. But the fact that they planted the seed that other people were already doing it increased it to 8%, almost three times. Right. And we've seen this in same thing, just simply saying don't litter. But if there's a big ad campaign that said Americans are more likely to litter, and it actually increased it because I'm identifying as an American. I'm identifying with other people who are doing this. And it's just wild how sometimes just the language, or when I see others or others are okay to do that, so the old adage, if your mom ever asked you, would you jump off a bridge? So, some of the data might actually say, well, if it's my friends doing it, I might.
Yeah, that is fascinating. We are reaching an ad break. I would love, after the ad break, to get further into this combination of hope, fear, identity, and how to apply that in positive
Yeah.
workplace politics ways, where we could influence for good. We can influence to gather people around, inclusion and better outcomes. Love to get into that. So you're listening to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Brancu, and our guest today, Zach Ames, and we'll be right back in just a moment.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the nonprofit sector connector, coming at you from my attic.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you...
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the nonprofit sector connector, coming at you from my attic. Each week here on TalkRadio.NYC, I host a program, Philanthropy in Focus. Nonprofits impact us each and every day, and it's my focus to help them amplify their message and tell their story. Listen each week at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on TalkRadio.NYC.
Were you an essential worker during the pandemic? If you needed to learn stages of epilepsy, did you depend on advocates? Did you use new innovations to cope with mental and neurological issues? Maintaining high quality of life and keeping good mental health are what we all strive for. I'm Frank R. Harrison, host of Frank About Health, and each week top healthcare influencers, professionals, and innovators answer these questions and more. Stay tuned on Thursdays at 5 p.m. on talkradio.nyc, and I will continue to be frank about health with all of you.
Hi, I'm Linda Marsanico. The A Train to Sedona is a memoir about my journey to love and compassion. It's also the name of my new broadcast on Wednesdays at 12 noon. When we are spiritual, we embrace possibilities and ideas, which strengthen our mind, body, spirit, health, and wisdom. On the A Train to Sedona broadcast, I plan to interview guests who embrace these expansive practices. Join us on Wednesdays at 12 noon on Talk Radio New York City.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mara Brancu, and our guest today, Zach Ames. And Zach talked with us first about the mindset shift required to really positively engage in healthy, productive, effective communication and influencing skills. And then shared with us some really interesting frameworks, Aristotle's framework around pathos, logos, and ethos. And then this hope, fear, and identity is where we left off. And I'm really curious about how we can apply this, how leaders can apply this to creating healthy workplace environments. I'm also curious about where the hiccups and the pitfalls could happen. So walk me through, like, if I'm a leader and I'm trying to let's go big, create culture change, right? How does hope, fear, and identity play into how I communicate at the individual level, at the team level, and at the organizational level? What does it look like?
Yeah, it's an interesting one and I think it depends on how big that change is. And so sometimes, and I want to be really clear here, I think it goes back to kind of our very beginning piece of, if I'm influencing and I'm not being influenced, this idea, one of the most common questions I get when we talk about influence is like, well, is this manipulation, right? And so I want to be very clear back to the mindset thing. The intent here really is that I'm not sitting here trying to pull strings and get people to do things that they wouldn't do otherwise, right? That's another core element, I think, of behavioral economics is we want to influence the conditions whereby people can make their own best decisions, but we aren't forcing hands. And we aren't, it's not threats, especially that fear thing is like, if you don't do this, then we're gonna, whatever. That said, we can also be honest and again, hit some of that pathos piece of, hey, this is the direction this company is going. If things don't change, here's the result. And if that's honest, that's a really powerful and sometimes very important thing for people to say, hey, let's shape up. I actually was in it was a really powerful meeting that my team got called into. We had just got, our global head had left. The new global head had been brought in, wasn't necessarily let's talk about identity, wasn't necessarily part of our tribe, was kind of an outsider, didn't speak our language, didn't really know what we did. It was a weird fit in terms of the team. And so there was some kind of back channel talking and quite frankly, some gossip and question mark. And therefore you could imagine the behavior and some resistance. And we had I think not the head of HR, but the other person above our global head anyway, in terms of rank, basically got everyone in a room and said that one, this needs to stop, and two, either shape up or ship out. Like, we are so grateful for everything you've done to get us to this point in this on this team and in this organization, but this is the new direction we're headed. And this is what we need, and this is the reason we made this decision. We are so grateful for all the hard work, but this is what we're doing, and we need to move on. And it wasn't a like ultimatum and this big fear-based thing. It was just very matter of fact of this is what's happening. I've also seen it work in really good ways too around talk about hope, the story of what's possible. I think people latch onto that, especially in difficult times. If we do this, especially if you're trying to get that extra effort out of individuals and across a broader organization, this is what's possible. If we really believe, it's why we talk about the values on the walls and have mission statements and all that stuff. Some of it we can kind of read between the lines and go, that's just a consultant threw something together, versus do we really believe this? Is this our story? Is there a hopeful future if we are able to accomplish this, right? I often joke that it didn't take rocket scientists to get us to the moon. It was JFK standing and saying, right, I have this idea that we will one day. Obviously, it took many rocket scientists, but when that one statement of this idea of hope or this idea of what could be, all the resources, our national attention changed, budgets changed, probably hiring decisions changed, and we actually got ourselves in that direction. And it was about the hope of a future. It was the story that got told. And it was a lot of the identity that I want to be part of that, or I believe in that too, right? So you see these strings kind of coming together often. It's rarely one thing, but multiple things that we can braid together to get us our results.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking like in the first story that you had, just sending the message, this is not us. We don't do this, right?
Yep.
Is a way to shape the identity of a positive work culture by describing what is a negative work culture that we don't want, right? And in kind of that second is like, what is possible for us as a country to achieve, right? And I'm also thinking about like my own process as I over the years have tried to hone my own messaging about what I offer. And what I'm often struggling with is sometimes I have hired or read marketing books that keep telling me the same thing. Up the sense of urgency, up the fear factor, make people feel like you're, talk to the pain point. And I have found it nearly impossible for me to do because it's so misaligned with feeling authentic to how I do things. The hope piece, the identity piece feels a lot more aligned. But I have also seen that in, just like in our own country, sometimes describing what could go wrong, the fear factor, right? If you don't take this action seems to work really well. Unfortunately, I don't love that, but that seems to be a message that also seems to work. Is there a way to like combine it, but in authentic ways instead of ways that like you mentioned already, not manipulating people, but in ways that is with integrity?
Yeah. So I think your example is great and actually probably is combined, right? If you're only telling people, hey, in our line of work and industry, I can now see it a mile away on Instagram when someone says, hey, I have 5 spots open. No, you don't. We all know that that's now become a technique. It's a tactic. Doesn't mean it doesn't
Although I actually
hurt.
only make 6 spots open, just to be clear. But
Right. Well, and that's the thing. So if it's genuine and honest, but
Yeah.
if it's being sent and it is out of concern for the ability for someone because you care and hey, you've talked about this. We know the hope that you have for yourself. Here's the work and a solution I provide, and I believe that's genuine. And there are only 6 spots left. I'm doing it as a partner to let you know and give you more information.
Yeah.
Is
That's
very
right.
different from false urgency. That's accurate urgency, right? Similarly, though, I fall for it all the time. If there is an extra 60% off of the sale items at J. Crew, I spend $100 every time, right? And it's because I also know that there are only so many sizes or that the sale will not be here next week. So that's always going to be a factor, but oftentimes it's the hope piece combined with that, which allows us to do that. And even as you said, without getting into the details of the politics, I actually think as much as we fear what the country could be in some of our votes, it is linked very heavily to a hope for the kind of country we want it to
That's
be.
true. Yes.
So the dials often, I rarely am I living in a world of switches. I think we live in a world of dials, and how much am I cranking one up or turning the other one down, or what's the combination of the two?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, where have you seen the greatest misunderstandings or pitfalls when leaders try to put all of this together and try to improve their sort of like win-win outcomes and being, leading with integrity, trying to create positive change using these techniques?
Um, there's a couple places that might come to mind. I think one is sometimes when people think, oh, the kind of leader I need to be, and I agree, we should be more connected. We're already hearing in our conversation more around relationships. And what sometimes that does, though, is it moves a leader to a point where they feel they can't make a decision or they have to satisfy everyone's needs. Right? If I'm open
Yeah.
and I'm trying to influence, and I feel I have to be open to influence, therefore I have to listen to everyone, I have to satisfy everyone, that becomes really, really difficult.
Yes.
Unfortunately, or maybe in a good way, most companies are not democracies. Not everyone has a vote, right? You take in that information, but that becomes a data point, but you still get to say, even as my leader in that example said, this is the direction we're headed, right? And so sometimes there will be, and you make that decision knowing very well that there what might be some ramifications. Some people might leave. You may have to have that really tough conversation and fire some people. But with that ability, when you're trying to navigate too many things and satisfy too many things or too many people, you end up not really going anywhere. I see this especially one of the biggest challenges for companies is in that startup phase, who everyone was doing everything and rolled up their sleeves, and it was scrappy and there was energy, and it wasn't really an HR, and you can kind of do anything and everything, and you get up to 50 people, maybe 80 people, and all of a sudden you have to shift and actually put in some structure. You have to put in an org chart. You have to put in certain policies, and people start to say, well, this isn't the company I joined, or I don't believe in this anymore. Or my other favorite, I remember very distinctly someone saying, I'm doing too much. I'm in too many, I'm spread too thin. And so the company I was working with, they hired someone else to take on a big part of that role. And the person then went, I'm no longer in all the decisions. What's happening? And we're like, well, we gave you what you wanted, and didn't realize there was consequences to that they are not as influential as they were in these things. But the ability, though, in that, I love that word you've used, right? What feels aligned to you, and often most companies or founders have that, is what is still true for us, what is our true outcome, what is best for our consumer and customer. And the market's going to constantly change. So we will change and evolve, but how do we do that in a way that is still true to us? How do we still tell the right story around that? And know that there will be some impact to that. Everyone who starts with us may not be the people who finish with us, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Yeah. I really appreciate that, and I'm thinking that's a perfect time to use storytelling, because
Absolutely.
there's so many people that get stuck on, but we always did this way, or but I had that job in that way, and I don't like the way things are, and I want it to go back, or I want it to, you know and if you're able to structure in a storytelling way by saying, we used to do this, and then we learned this, and then we decided to move in this direction, and what we learned is this, it helps like move people along to like help be part of that story, and that also connects to the identity piece as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Love this. We are reaching our final ad break. You're listening to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Branco, and our guest today, Zachary Ames. We air on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll be right back in just a moment. Are you a high-achieving, growth-oriented leader? Are you interested in developing your authentic leadership while creating a healthy, inclusive workplace? Hi, I'm Dr. Mira Branco, host of The Hard Skills on talkradio.nyc at 5 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays, where we discuss how leaders develop the hard skills needed to make a greater impact. We interview experts, have live coaching, and tackle these challenges. Listen to The Hard Skills on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern on talkradio.nyc.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the nonprofit sector connector, coming at you from my attic. Each week here on TalkRadio.NYC, I host a program, Philanthropy in Focus. Nonprofits impact us each and every day, and it's my focus to help them amplify their message and tell their story. Listen each week at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on TalkRadio.NYC.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant, and on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays, 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Branco, and our guest today, Zachary Ames. So we've been pulling all of these frameworks together around the mindset and kind of the storytelling, the way to think about how to convey a message authentically and with integrity, bringing out, people's possibilities and how they identify. And I can't help but go, take this back to kind of your next step in your, company's trajectory by, you added another company, Prism Leadership, which aims to accelerate and advance the careers of LGBTQ plus individuals. And I'm wondering how you are thinking about the impact, the influence through that work, and how that might relate to everything that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's an interesting journey. Speaking of storytelling, I'll give a very brief one. One of my very first real corporate job, it was at Bloomingdale's in the heart of New York City on 59th and Lexington, doing this type of work and leadership development. And yeah, it was the first time in my early 20s after living in Utah my whole life that I started living, as my true self as an out gay man, but I didn't know how to do that in a corporate setting, or what that meant or what the ramifications were, and a lot of question marks there. So they had a head of diversity, and I knocked on her door and sat down and literally asked, how do I come out at work? And we joke about it now that, it wasn't like a high school counselor's office. There was no little trifold pamphlet to hand, but she was very nice and very polite. And we had conversations about it. And some of the irony, right, was that I was in New York. I was working in fashion, in retail. My boss's boss, had the quarter share in Fire Island, a famous, gay beach resort and destination. And yet, the most senior leadership, the people who sat on the quote unquote 7th floor of the store, they were all in their black suits and none of them were out. I did not see that representation and still needed and had those questions even in what was not unexplicitly a very open and inclusive environment. So I remember that very, very early on. And then as I've continued my career, just as someone who's helped people advance their own careers, that's been my job inside most organizations, is to do that. And when you do the research, it doesn't take much to do. There's only 3 out CEOs in all of the Fortune 100 and the FTSE
Wow.
500 and 100. So it's super, super small numbers. You dig even further, most board directors, it's not even 1% of board seats of publicly
Wow.
traded companies are out, and many of those are filled by the same person. And so the representation of where some of this power sits and lies is not representative of, again, just the broader population. So the idea of Prism, therefore, is pretty simple. It's to help people accelerate their careers. And when I look at it, we have the playbook. I've done it with so many other individuals. There's clearly this group that doesn't necessarily have that playbook. And so why not give it to them is really the basic premise.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of the sort of way to apply influence, um, hope, identity, storytelling, how might you think about how a leader who is in the top ranks of an organization and is committed
Mhm.
to creating an inclusive environment that's comfortable for people to come out, for people to feel comfortable
Yeah.
with their true selves, what might they be able to do to use some of these skills in order to create that?
So it's an interesting. So as I kind of looked at that data, I went, I can't be the only one person who's seeing this. And there are a lot of organizations out there who are doing exactly what you've said. And I think it's very good and very positive. And unfortunately, though, it's still missing the mark. So a lot of people are saying or telling the story or using in their advertising, right? Or do big pride events, and they try to keep signaling that it's okay. But what's not happening and what we've moved away from is some of the reality of what it means to be a senior leader. And it's become this dirty word. So I'm glad you're talking about it, even in your upcoming book. But it's a key piece of the PRISM curriculum is the idea of positive politics. And it doesn't mean that it's bad and wrong and back channeling and all this stuff, but recognizing that in every company and every culture, there are centers of influence and positions of power. And quite frankly, even some of the interesting research, even chimpanzees do this. They curry favor by bringing bananas to the head chimp, and also do association and affiliate with the right people in the group. And so if we don't recognize what that is, or what I often talk about, like the proverbial golf course, the politics is happening whether or not you're choosing to play it or be part of it or not. And I started to think that it's a bad thing, so we don't talk about it anymore. But the reality is, when you're coming back from a client meeting, if someone is not pulling you aside and saying, hey, this is what went really well, or hey, that didn't go well, we need to circle back and make sure, otherwise we're on risk of burning that bridge. It's that inside scoop that typically gives you the inside track. And unfortunately, just from a saturations number, the like-mindedness and identity piece, we often aren't mentoring and sponsoring and giving that informal information to members of the LGBT community, or, and quite frankly, many other underrepresented groups. It's not just this one. And so that actually would be my advice to anyone. Who are you talking to? Who are you giving that inside scoop to? How do you give it to others? And on the other side, that's our hope with this program, is to actually give that opportunity to people to advocate for themselves and seek it out.
That's fantastic. I mean, you and I are both on the same page around this. Like, you working with the LGBTQ plus population, and me working primarily to help women and underrepresented women navigate complex work cultures and unspoken rules about those cultures. Is most folks in these historically marginalized situations just have not had access to that information, to the resources to navigate these systems and the unspoken rules. There's lots of rules you can find in policies, but there's these unspoken rules about how to navigate the culture. And when that happens, when you understand and it's revealed in a much more clear way, oh, okay, these are the informal influencers, and these are the pieces of information I didn't know about. it makes such a massive difference in your career trajectory and outcome, right?
Yeah, just as
Yeah.
simple as I learned early on, if I needed a meeting with a certain senior leader, I needed to curry favor with the executive assistant.
Yeah,
Right. So it wasn't,
exactly.
again, it wasn't manipulation. I genuinely enjoyed that person. But if I didn't maintain that relationship or ask about the grandkids every time I was near in their office area, I didn't get what I needed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So if people are interested in reaching out and connecting with you, tell us, where can they find you?
You can find me at, I've got a couple different Instagram handles, but mostly if you come to my website, xyzleadership.xyz, for any and all things leadership and training and development. Or if you're interested specifically about this LGBT leadership program we have, Prism Leadership, that's PRYSM. There are contact details there. You can reach out to myself or any of our team members. We'd be happy to share more.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, folks. So what did you take away from today's talk? And more importantly, what is one small change that you can implement this week based on what you learned from Zach? Share it with us on LinkedIn, as well as at talkradio.nyc, so we could cheer you on. And talkradio.nyc is also on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, Apple, Spotify, Amazon podcasts, all over the place. Please help us increase our visibility, reach, and impact, so that we can help other people by leaving a review. The stuff that I talk about on this show is part of my research-based strategic leadership pathway roadmap that I use to help socially conscious organizational misfits on their leadership journeys. You can find out more about us at www.cotowerscope.com. And now you've learned how to also access Zach and his brilliant resources. So do so. And make sure to look him up on his podcast as well. His podcast, again, is Expand Your Zone, so you can hear more about him. Thank you to talkradio.nyc for hosting. Thank you for joining us today with Zachary Ames. Zach, thank you for joining us and sharing.
Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of your day, everybody, wherever you're tuning in from. Bye, all.